Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us and staying with us up until now. We are about to start the last panel discussion of the day. Congratulations on making it so far. The panel discussion is titled Safety Beyond Surveillance, a Rights and Justice Framework for Safety in EU Digital Policies. My name is Chloé Berthelemy. I'm Senior Policy Advisor at EDRi, European Digital Rights, and I will moderate this discussion about current EU security policies and approaches, and what paradigm shift we need to ensure safety and protection for all in Europe and beyond. And I'm very mindful of those words in the very moment where Israel started invading the south of Lebanon. There is a troubling global trend towards intensifying securitization, repression, and the erosion of rule of law, individual rights and freedoms. And unfortunately, Europe is not spared from that. What we're going to do in the discussion is first take a look back at the years that just passed to identify the general trends in the European Union with regards to law enforcement policies and practices, and to analyze where and how technologies support these policies and practices. We cannot be comprehensive because it's a very wide scope, but we'll do our best, obviously, to give you a big picture about where we are at, what is the state of play today. And then we will discuss about the shift we want to see in this new legislative mandate, what alternative approaches are needed to achieve safety, protection, and care for everybody, and going away from the kind of dominant approach which centers surveillance and criminalization. But I will not go further into detail because I have 5 great speakers who will explain you more about this. The first is Jennifer Kamau. She is the co-founder and an activist at the International Women's Space, which is a feminist, anti-racist political group based in Berlin, composed of refugee, migrant, and non-migrant women. And since 2012, IWS documents the violence of the asylum system and migration policies and how they impact the lives of refugees and migrant women in Germany. Next to Jennifer is Sarah Chander. She is the director of the Equinox Initiative of Racial Justice, which is a queer, racialized-led organization with a vision for creating societies of care and protection. Equinox works to shift policies and resources in the European Union away from policing, punishment, borders, and surveillance, and towards systems of protection and social provision. Equinox is a coordinator of the Protect Not Surveil coalition, which is working to contest harmful digital surveillance practices in policing and migration control. Then we have Elena Castillo Jimenez. She's an advocacy and policy advisor on digital surveillance at the Security Lab at Amnesty International. She's leading there the work on spyware, and she's also a feminist human rights lawyer. Then we have Anna Burta, who is the head of policy and consultation at the European Data Protection Supervisor, the EDPS, very important role. She leads there the work in providing advice and analysis to EU co-legislator on legislative proposal with data protection impacts. And last but not least, we have Lise Schwimmer, who is the parliamentary assistant to Saskia Brikmont, who couldn't make it today, but Lise kindly jumped in to replace her and spread the good word, I would say. Saskia Brikmont is a member of the European Parliament in the Greens political group, coming from Belgium, and Lise and Saskia have been working together as part of the Civil Liberties Committee, the LIBE Committee, on topics of police, justice, and migration in the past mandate. Is that correct? Yeah. We all use she, her pronouns. So let's kickstart the discussion with the first round of questions that I would like to address to our speakers. Again, aiming at describing the general law enforcement trends and how the EU is embracing certain stricter policing policy and practices and authoritarian tendencies with more tech-supported surveillance. Sarah, the organization Equinox envisages these processes through the analytical lens of power dynamics and racialization. Can you kickstart this conversation and share with us your thought on how the EU's approach to security has developed in the past mandate to a digital element, please?
Yes, and thank you, everyone. And also thank you for bearing with us after a very long day of intense conversations, lots of information, so appreciate that. Before I start, I would like to say that, yes, we are having the pleasure to gather here today in the luxury of relative safety. And as we've mentioned throughout the event, we are still in the midst of ongoing genocides and occupations in Congo, in Sudan, in Kanaki, in Palestine, and in the latter of which Israel's violent onslaught has expanded to Lebanon. And all of these conflicts, occupations, genocides are intertwined, fueled, funded, caused in some ways by our institutions, our frameworks, and our ways of living here in Europe, and specifically in the context of Israel, but also others. There is a very direct relationship in terms of the funding and sale of surveillance technology. I don't want to start with this just because I think that these phenomenon have a tech implication and so can be neatly brought into the tech conversation, although of course they can in very clear ways, which we saw in the previous panel. But I want to say instead that we cannot have a conversation on tech and society that conveniently ignores what's going on in the rest of the world and how our specific political and economic systems support these horrors. With that in mind, and with the very specific link to surveillance technology, I'm going to talk today about a process of digital securitization. And as we've seen from the various trends in EU's policy lately, security is more than ever a central part of EU politics, and is increasingly sprawling out to a range of different other fields, migration, digitalisation, and many other aspects. But we don't often stop and think about the concept of security. So what are the value judgments that we place when we talk about that word security? What are the assumptions behind it? What do we equate it to? What do we not? Often we in the European space, in the European policy bubble, feel and speak of safety as a parallel or as an equal to safety. So we may assume, and we also often may assume, that there is a universal picture of how safety is fulfilled, how we achieve safety. Instead of security as a concept, I like to focus on the concept of securitization, which I think of is the fusing of public safety as a concept with the police, with borders, and the military. Securitization for me is about the mobilization of resources, legislation, narratives, and increasingly technologies to the process of criminalization. What do I mean by that, and why is that important for us here in this room? We live in a society where the notion of security is heavily constructed around the idea that we need states and institutions to bring a criminal response to social problems in our society, social issues, social broader questions that we're thinking about, be they activities or incidents that cause direct violence to people, individual violence, or things that impact property, like theft, or even activities that don't necessarily have a clear or negative impact on people's safety or harm, such as the criminalization of sex work, of drug use, of movement, migration, or protest. The idea in these contexts is that the state and institutions have an authority to punish people for engaging in these types of activities, and that they should do so in the name of our safety. Little attention in this framework is applied to why people do these things, what causes them to do them. Rather, the focus is on that those things are wrong. Those engaging in it are individually responsible, and that there must be a punitive response from the state when those things happen, often including something like a fine, material impact on their lives, or depriving them of liberty. What I want to talk about today is that the EU is increasingly producing a framework of digital securitization. The digitalisation agenda is increasingly serving this broader securitization project. And this is showing up all over the place in legislation, in our institutional changes, and specifically the ways in which public resources are spent. Many of you in the room will be familiar with the AI Act, and that is a framework for fueling innovation, increasing more AI into our society, all of those good things. Those of us who looked at the AI Act from the perspective of policing and migration control had a question about, is the AI Act a good thing? Did it protect us from harmful forms of surveillance? Or did it instead enable surveillance in many ways? We saw specifically with that legislation that they failed to prohibit some of the most intense forms of discrimination, discriminatory AI, and specifically those types of AI that impact marginalized communities. So we asked for many things. We asked for a ban on the use of AI to perform mass surveillance in public space. We asked for prohibitions on predictive policing and uses of AI to surveil migrants in the migration context. Many of them were half done, or they were done incompletely. How does this feed a broader digital securitization framework? Not only did the AI Act not do enough to prevent that criminalization, racialized form of surveillance, it also has to be seen in a broader framework where the EU in other areas is actively pushing digital projects that support a heavily surveillant, criminalizing-based security. And the best way, the way that we can make that point is looking at the broader EU migration policy. Many of you may know that the last mandate passed a huge piece of legislation called the EU Migration Pact, which was several pieces of legislation. And we'll hear a little bit, maybe perhaps a bit more about that later. There were lots of things that changed in that piece of legislation, but on a surveillance angle, what that did was endorse and in many ways expanded this way of surveilling and criminalizing migrants. The pact in that case took numerous steps to ramp up the digital systems used to prevent and control migration, put more digital technologies, processing algorithms into the management of asylum, encourage the use of technologies into the management of detention centers, creating technological prison-based prison-like systems for migrants, and expanded a already broad regime for the digital monitoring of migrants, which I think Jennifer will touch upon. Some of this is being expanded in the current mandate with something called the Facilitators Package, which is increasing the criminalization of migration and also expanding the level of resources to punitive agencies like Europol, which the EU proposes a further 50 million in funding for. All of this in terms of legislation is complemented by an investment process, the development of more resources to punitive and systems of control. So the organization State Watch published a piece of information which looked at Frontex's 2023 procurement plan. And it said that that included over 260 million for IT systems for Frontex and a further 180 million for border surveillance equipment to increase for the purpose of increasing deportations. The last aspect to this is that much of this investment is not going to agencies, policing agencies, authorities per se, but it is outsourced through contracts to private companies. And so therefore, I would say part and parcel of this digital securitization project is therefore the encroachment of the private sector, including technology and military companies, into state functions, integrating profit motives into things that we normally see as democratically governed functions and institutions. So these are some of the aspects, legislation, funding, policies that I think are coming into this digital securitization process. And yeah, happy to expand more.
Yeah, can you expand more? You touched upon it in your answers. We can already kind of see some element of it, but how do you see all of this developments connected to structural racism in this field?
Yeah, not at all a planned question. So basically, a lot of us, when we talk about, if we've been in a space before where we talk about the connection between technology and race, you'll hear this phrase a lot, that technologies disproportionately impact certain communities, will have a disproportionate impact on communities. And especially in policing and migration control, that's often come up. It's come often from US narratives, especially looking at studies, really important studies, specifically done by Black women into the efficacy of policing systems, mainly facial recognition systems, and how well they can identify people of color, racialized people, and specifically Black and brown faces. That question of disproportionate impact definitely applies when we look at how surveillance technologies are rolled out on communities in Europe. You'll definitely see a disproportionate impact. Another way you might look at that is a targeting. Maybe you might see more surveillance cameras rolled out in a certain context or in a certain area, depending on where, especially related to economic areas, how many poor people live there, how many single mothers live there, how many racialized people live there. The purpose of that technology might be to identify migrants, as we've seen in various systems in Italy, using the public space perhaps for rough sleeping. So with all of those things, you're seeing this connection between race, class, gender, and this question of disproportionate impact is definitely there. What I would like to say in the context of structural racism and technology is that, yes, we should look at the disproportionate impact of those systems, so how we as communities are at the receiving ends of those technologies. But I think we also need to look at the role that these technologies play and these broader securitization frameworks play in actively producing the concept of criminality, of crime. What actually we're seeing with the massive investment of resources into these criminal frameworks, these digital criminal frameworks, is the creation of a concept of criminality in our communities, a creation of a notion that we are doing something wrong, we should be surveilled, controlled, and punished for it, rather than as we are people, we are groups, we're individuals with needs, and that should be the driver of public policy. One clear example of that is the increased resort to more and more technologies for the surveillance at the borders and migration control. You could say that this is part of responding to a very linear process where we have identified a migration process that is around criminality, is preventing illegal migration. Another way to say that is a bit more of a parallel process where we have digital policy, which is also creating a narrative, creating a political ideology around that we need more technologies, we need more data-driven systems in order to illegalize a population. So there is a direct active role that digitalization processes are playing here in this broader securitization concept. And that, I think, is the aspect of structural racism that I would like us to shift to thinking about. Beyond direct disproportionate impact, how a digitalization is actually shaping a racialized policy, and how resources are redirected in that direction, as opposed to somewhere else, somewhere where we might want or need more. And we can talk about that a little bit more.
In the second part of the discussion, this will come up probably, especially this proactiveness and this shaping power of technologies on certain policies. And Jennifer, as Sarah just touched upon, migration is one of these fields where this is the most evident, it's most blatant, where securitization and criminalization trends are ramping. And your organization has documented in depth and in several different formats, notably through the voice of people affected, the discriminatory policies and practices of the German state against migrants and refugees. Can you explain to us concretely what does digital repression look like in your context?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah, for the good introduction. I think the most important is to make a picture of how it is, and I will contextualize this, focusing on the Mediterranean, for example. that when people survive coming through the Mediterranean, the first thing they do when they are able to cross over to the borders is something you would call clocking. And this clocking, first they take the fingerprints of people arriving at the Mediterranean, even without the people understanding why the fingerprints are being taken. And once their fingerprints are taken, of course, they are stored in the database, in Eurodac. And moving from one European country to another European country becomes a nightmare, because even without being informed of what the impact of your fingerprints in the database, the minute you leave one European country, and I'm focusing on Italy, Malta, and Spain, and Greece also, where there is a lot of people, even when it was discussed that there should be equal distribution of the refugees within the European countries, and of course, Germany being in the center. Germany, of course, I mean, I'm not even going to focus on Germany for now. But then, when you enter one European country and you move to the other European country to seek asylum, the first thing that you're slapped with is a Dublin regulation. And this Dublin regulation, of course, the biggest thing it does is that you are denied basic human rights in the second country of entry because they don't feel responsible for your asylum system. So then what happens, it's mass deportation. Then there is a negotiation whether the first country will take you, and then you're deported, and then there's a lot happening in between. And this is one, and this is where, for example, artificial intelligence is really being used effectively in the acts of deportation. And this is where Frontex is also heavily funded to execute this violent deportations. In these processes of people being illegalized in this way, because once you don't want to be in this database, you have to live undocumented, then it means you live in a country where you don't have the basic human rights. So what happens? You're forced to take any other job that will provide for your livelihood. And we know what these jobs are. So this is one of the impact of the data, the artificial intelligence. And when I give it a context, again, that coming from the global majority, the kind of funding that is given to these countries is, for example, for the biometric passports. And one of the agreements is that these biometrics are also, this data is shared very equally, I mean, very generously across countries, and people are not even aware. So when they already talk of these strict border policies, they started to prepare 5 years before. And it's just now that people are realizing, even with the biometrics, that now even to be deported, they don't need your passport because they have your fingerprints in the database, and they're just going to produce a document that will just enable you to be deported easily and quickly. So those are some of the things that are affecting. The other thing, for example, is with the Bezahlkarte, the card that Germany is introducing to reduce social support money for people within the asylum system. So what this card also will do is something that was abolished 10 years ago with the voucher system. But now they introduce it in this form of a digital way with a bank card that, again, still it's not clear whether people will use these bank cards in controlled areas of residences, or it will be across board. And then again, it will be easy to monitor people who are on deportation and understand their movements. So those are some of the things that are not being discussed.
So technology is very much about like controlling movement all across the spectrum. Yes. We'll come back to Germany in the second time. There's much going on at national level currently, and we'll love to hear from you. I'd like to turn now to Lise. You worked extensively on the reform of Europol the EU Law Enforcement Cooperation Agency in the past mandate, and you had to intervene multiple times, I think, to rein the agency in their attempt to criminalize migrants, refugees, activists, and so on. Like, you asked accountability from Europol directors, and notably there was one case involving cooperation with between Frontex and Europol, notably in the form of a mass data exchange that raised a lot of concern, and that program was called EDRi. Can you briefly explain what it is, and then I'll ask a follow-up question?
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thanks to the previous speakers as well for the points they have raised. Indeed, Saskia has been working a lot on the Europol 2020 reform. She's also part of the scrutiny group at the parliamentary level, which is scrutinizing the work of the agency. So throughout our work, and also thanks to the work of independent investigative journalists, we've come across the EDRi program. EDRi program stands for Processing of Personal Data for Risk Analysis. It's a program developed by Frontex with the objective to collect personal data, including very sensitive personal data, such as religious belief or sexual orientation, which is aimed at, and I'm using a Frontex word here, to develop capabilities for processing the personal data of suspects of cross-border crimes. Those data were collected by Frontex officers without the assistance of legal counsel for the person heard or judicial procedure checks. Just to give a blunt example, so a person would be interviewed after they arrived. They would say, I paid this guy €1,000 for crossing, and the name of this person would then end up in a security database without even being double-checked. This is just an example, but that shows how quick that could, your name actually could end up in a security database. So the Frontex officer would collect through interviews, but also through checks on social media. They would collect information on people suspected of committing cross-border crimes, and those data would then be transmitted to Europol, and that would then feed into internal security databases, again, without any judicial checks on their legality or reality. Another use, and there I would echo what Sarah said about the concept of criminality, this collection of data also allows for risk analysis. Therefore, that also paves the way to actually how EU internal security is conceived and how it's going to be done in the coming years. So this data is not only used for proper individual investigation, but also for, let's say, for macro analysis on internal security.
Thank you very much. And generally, a lot of concerns were raised around this program, and we even learned from the work of investigative journalists that the DPO, so the Data Protection Officer of Frontex, had internally raised strong reservation towards the program. But nonetheless, because it's driven by this criminalization process, this mass surveillance went ahead. We talk about mass surveillance because it's mass transfer of data. As you said, it's barely any checks happening. Can you tell us a little bit what you think about the strength and resilience of our existing oversight mechanism to prevent such backsliding into mass surveillance?
Well, it's a really good question. First, it shows that oversight mechanisms are crucial. Is it working at the moment? I cannot say it does, obviously, but it can be improved. We've been working extremely hard. For those who followed the Europol reform, we actually asked for a fundamental rights officer position to be in the mandate of Europol. We also asked for a consultative forum on fundamental rights to be created, and we managed, but there was strong reservations and strong opposition, both from the European Commission, but also from Europol's, from inside Europol, but also from other political groups. There are many safeguards in place somehow, but they also, if they are not respected, it takes supervision to make them respected. And then we need to strengthen the current oversight with, for example, giving like real binding powers to the Joint Parliamentary Scrutiny Group, which for now is just a nice club of people enjoying the fact that they all love Europol and they travel all around Europe to talk about it. Here we have a real powers and we should use them. And here, for example, I would really invite you to reach out to the MEPs which are in this group and to actually make them aware of the powers they have. They can ask questions, they can actually follow up on the replies made by the agencies, and they can seek further information. Here, and this is going to please my neighbor from the left, we also believe that EDPS should be sufficiently funded with money, but also with human resources to actually do the supervisory work they are doing. I mean, for the first investigation on the massive data sets which were identified at Europol, that was thanks to EDPS. Without them, nothing would have been done. Also, potentially, the reform would not have been done, but that's another story. We also need funding for independent journalists, because also without them, EDRi would not have been unveiled. Why? Because we don't have the capacities to follow everything the agency is doing on a daily basis. We also need to feed culture of transparency and openness within EU agencies, and for this we need political pressures. And we have tools at our disposal. I mentioned the Joint Parliamentary Scrutiny Group, but we also have budgetary tools, for example, like discharges. We can ask them, like, you know, what are you doing with EU public money? Do you actually respect EU values? We need to follow those processes. We need to keep accountability high on the European Commission and agencies. The last Europol reform was just a response to Europol wrongdoings. You cannot make legislation just for the sake of legalizing illegal practices. And for this, we need public attention. Legislation has to respond to gaps and needs, not like, you know, you're doing something wrong, okay, let's actually make it good. This is just not possible. We also need to enhance the critical voice on internal security, and here, I must say progressive groups are not often, and we are not investing enough those fields. We need to work more. We need to ensure rule of law and fundamental rights are strictly respected. And here, I mean, considering the recent political developments with the surge of our rights, but also, like, I will call it this way, the radicalization of conservative and Christian Democrats, it's very, I'm not really optimistic, but we never know.
Thank you, Liz. Yes, me neither. The criminalization of certain categories of people, which we've heard throughout the different interventions now and contribution, and those who are mostly marginalized are a driving force for justifying ever more strict security policies. And with modern technology, we've heard that we are reaching kind of new levels of intrusiveness that we've never seen before. So one example that really comes to mind is spyware. This is a profound change, I would say, in the toolbox of police authorities in Europe and in intelligence services' hands. And last mandate, we observed how easily it is for many European states to resort to such intrusive tools. And I'd like to hear a little bit more how it's connected to this discussion we're having today with Elina. Your Amnesty, your organization, has worked quite closely with other civil society actors, Citizen Lab, and so on, for years to gather evidence and document violation through the use of spyware. It's quite clear that the impacts of spyware are systemic. It's on the system level. And what do you think? Can you explain and expand on this point? What do you think spyware is the symptom of?
Well, thank you, Chloe, and thank you to all my co-panelists so far, and all of you for being here, making this dialogue possible. I think when you look at the body of work that many of us have contributed to, spyware can be a symptom of many things. What I will start by saying is it's a symptom of a deterioration and a crackdown on civic space and human rights. And there is also a feeling of complacency, perhaps, and like a normalization of something that shouldn't be normalized. I think spyware is a tactic at the end of the day. It never happens in a vacuum. If you look at all the cases of individuals that have endured this form of a human rights violations. Typically is linked to their activity, they're an independent journalist or a human rights defender, or even a member of a political body or a government agency. And it oftentimes, in the case of HRDs, human rights defenders and journalists, connected to their exercise of daring to challenge power and daring to speak truth and just do their work. So I think spyware is this tactic that has become, despite it being highly sophisticated in a way, also too easily accessible in this toolkit that many states and governments around the world, regardless of the political spectrum, like you can find examples across the political spectrum, have just found it to be their tool of choice, it seems, to erode the human rights guarantees. And I think that it should be alarming to us that despite the many instances of reporting that have come across in the last couple of years, there is this initial moment of outcry and surprise and frustration and emotions that I think are, attached to that. But then it's been so difficult to lead that to action. I think that should be questioned. Like, we should be questioning ourselves and why is that the case. I think spyware is toxic as well. I think that the harms that this technology causes are well documented. We can see the pervasive effect it has in society, so it's not just at the individual level, the mental health impacts as well as physical health impacts, but also the impact that it has in the health of our communities, in silencing people, this chilling effect that it causes that makes people just self-censor and prefer to not be a part of the civic space at all, because it has been presented to us that as people, if you're willing and want to be part of a dialogue in a public forum, then you got the trade-off is surveillance, and that just doesn't make any sense, if you ask me. Like, I think this is too much of a high price to pay, especially because people shouldn't assume that if I want to exercise this role or just be an activist or just use my voice in the way that I feel, is in line with an exercise of my human rights, it shouldn't be assumed that then the outcome of that is going to be surveillance. I think that we should be questioning and be ashamed of the normalization of that tactic. And I think that last but not least is a symptom of an industry that has gone unregulated far too long. I think it's a symptom of a market dynamic that we should also call into question. I think we should see it as a symptom of industry players that have been profiting from this toxic dynamic, as you were saying, Sarah, Jennifer in particular, about this toxic idea of what national security means and what staying safe and keeping people safe means, that leads into building profit of making people feel unsafe, even not just from their own devices, but also trusting each other, because of this fear of surveillance. So I think it's just a failure. It's a moral failure as society, the fact that we're using this.
Thank you very much, Elina. That is a strong statement.
But it is, right? I mean, yeah.
But thank you for your honesty. I appreciate very much that. But you said, so spyware is not happening in a vacuum. Indeed, very much agree on that. It's happening in the context of various interconnected societal oppression. I wanted to ask, because Amnesty's done some work on this, if you could just briefly explain how you found spyware surveillance connected to gender violence.
Yeah, I think for a long time, we've talked a lot about spyware at the intersection of national security and human rights, which is a very obviously fair space to talk about it, but I also think that oftentimes we tend to forget that at the end of this, there's individuals, there's people that experience the impacts of being targeted by this technology, and therefore that calls for an intersectional approach. And I know that word oftentimes is used in a tokenistic way and a little bit of like a cute word, but I think that I am just in full transparency, even us at Amnesty, we had to have a little bit of a look in the mirror and be like, okay, like it's time for us to start building on the understanding that we've had about what impacts spyware produces. We haven't done anything on gender ourselves. Others have pointed out to the links. What can we do, in terms of like incorporate that in our research? If we're actually saying that we're an intersectional organization, we need to be, we're still working on it. But in this particular report that we worked on with some of my colleagues, one of them is actually here supporting today, documenting how women human rights defenders have experienced being targeted with Pegasus in particular in Thailand, and how their experiences were differentiated because of their gender identities, and because of their sexual orientations, and because of the work that they were doing in particular, and also interconnected with their other identities, including religion identities, racial identities, in the context of Thailand's crackdown on freedom of expression. I think the main conclusion for me, from my perspective, is that we should also start talking about surveillance as a form of gender-based violence, that we should not keep it separate. I think they are interconnected, and surveillance is a form of tech-facilitated gender-based violence, and therefore we should be also considering measures to curb those harms from that lens as well, and developing measures to protect people from those harms from that perspective.
Thank you very much. Yeah, very important to underline this. Anna, the EU has not been resting so much as we it started to do something to address the spyware crisis, which Edward Snowden has coined as the greatest crisis of computer security in computer history, nothing less. The EU has adopted the European Media Freedom Act, and as part of it, provision was designed to protect the rights of journalists and journalistic sources. I will spoil the outcome. It was disappointing for us, civil society. Do you agree with this assessment? Do you think it's a good response from the EU to the spyware challenge? Is it a good template for future EU legislation, in your opinion?
Thank you, and first of all, thank you for having me here. This is an excellent discussion, and I have already learned a lot. It is obviously a leading question. It's, you know, it's not the first time I'm asked questions about the MFA. So, I also, you know, I do work for a body that is technically an EU institution, but we have neither proposed nor negotiated this legal instrument. On the contrary, with our opinion, we are probably one of the first to point out that behind certainly very good intentions to curb the use of intrusive military-grade spyware with regard to journalists specifically, behind those good intentions, in fact, we might be dealing with an outcome that normalizes the use of such tools more than anything else. Now, compared to the initial proposal, the Parliament in particular has done quite some work to introduce additional safeguards. Nevertheless, from our perspective, which is strictly speaking data protection and privacy guarantees, and you know, we have been working in this space looking at data retention, government access to data, even aspects that are not strictly speaking within EU law, so oversight over intelligence gathering in member states, etc. So when you compare and the Strasbourg Court, European Court of Human Rights case law, when you compare what is in Article 4 of the Media Freedom Act as so-called guarantees and the safeguards that would normally be required under those other legal frameworks, yeah, I think disappointment is the least you can say. Why? You know, it's a very long now and convoluted provision, probably because of those various additions during the legislative process. Let me also just say that we have seen it many, many times. It's not just civil society that is frustrated with the obscurity of the trialogues and the fact that things are added and changed without much transparency. In my day job, what we do is assess legislative proposals, issue opinions to the Parliament, to the Council. We often tell Commission in advance when they want to consult with us informally what we think should be changed. We have done so, but you know, opinions are not binding. So when they are not taken into account, just left aside, we are pretty much in the same boat as you guys. And afterwards, we can only, you know, print T-shirts, we told you so, but that doesn't really help us make any progress here. So just to give you one example, one of the criterion that is listed there for the use of such spyware against media organizations and journalists, etc., is an overriding public interest. This is contrary to what you might think a very soft phrase in EU law. So it should have been, well, it should probably have not been tackled in this way in the first place. A prohibition would have been nice, but if you want to enact exceptions, then I would say limiting things to criminal law, criminal proceedings strictly only, with exceptions, only when absolutely necessary, where other measures are not adequate, under very strict conditions of prior judicial authorization, and not necessarily only, either prior judicial authorization or maybe exposed, maybe by another administrative body, whichever it might be. It's not clear. Is it the Data Protection Authority? Is it the authority supervising law enforcement? If it's not judicial, what is independence in this case? Is it the body normally supervising intelligence agencies? It's all up in the air. So yes, I really very much, and to make things worse, one last sentence, to my mind, as a lawyer that has spent many years working with EU law, EU legislation, the provision is drafted that might potentially have worked if it were a directive. So it sets certain objectives, like the practices shall be compliant with the Charter, they shall respect the treaties, they shall do this, they shall do that. But it is in fact a regulation. So it really is now, I am personally not, I don't work for the Commission. I don't know how the Commission is going to go about implementing this regulation or enforcing it. But at the very least, it would seem to me that some really hard work on the part of the member states will be required to really come up with specific safeguards that could potentially achieve the objectives of making such use a very rare exception rather than something that is being done almost routinely. And so, yes, to us at the EDPS, this provision of the Media Freedom Act, I'm not criticizing the entire legislation. I'm here talking about specifically Article 4. I think it's point C, whatever, paragraph 4, regarding spyware. This is probably closer to, to an accident that might end up legitimizing the use of such tools instead of banning them or restricting really very heavily, in particular since we are speaking about a societal group, journalists, media organizations that has been in the past afforded judicial protections, and there are also precedents in the Court of Justice case law in relation to data retention, for example, that specifically require particular protections to be granted in this case. Could I say 2 sentences, maybe 3, about some of the other issues? You saw it coming, I'm sure. So just to say that I think because as EDPS we have a very broad overview of the EU legislation that has been coming for many years now, and maybe I have a less nefarious view on the motives behind all these legislations. I do believe that quite often at EU level this is driven by uncritical embrace of technology and innovation. And, you might see it differently, but compared to national budgets, the EU budget really is not that big, if we don't speak about agricultural subsidies. So the promise of having a nice fancy technology, a database or another tool that will solve all your problems in a minute is very tempting to EU decision makers, policy makers. And so once again, like behind the Media Freedom Act, we end up with good intentions playing out as usual. And again, I represent just the data protection, privacy, oversight. We do try to look at Frontex, Europol, and all of that. It's just a tiny little bit, but it might be quite important. So I am not at liberty today to discuss the investigations past or ongoing in that space. But just to give you the example of what is now perceived as increased criminalization and mixing of safety, security, migration, and border control, started out many years ago with the discussions of interoperability between the European large-scale systems. And at that time, guarantees, technical safeguards, like separations of those different information systems, because they serve different purposes, what we call purpose limitation in data protection law, was all of a sudden presented as inefficiency, as an obstacle, as an additional cost. And so purpose limitation went out the window, and here we are. Several years later, it turns out that, you know, it was more than just a principle that is now written somewhere in the GDPR or wherever, and nobody really knows what purposes it serves. You know, playing with that can have real life, very nefarious consequences several years down the line. So again, I don't know what to do about it. I think we should just join forces and also be mindful and very proactive, watching very, very closely what is happening in the policy-making space, in the regulation space, because quite often, by the time, you know, we reach the stage of acts being adopted or being implemented and applied on the ground, the world has already shifted, and it's just too late to do something meaningful about it. So hopefully this is, you know, we are here in Brussels, very, very close to the heart of the European decision-making. But you know, when you go to your respective countries, I think it's still important to try and watch this space very, very closely, because we must react swiftly and timely if we want to make a change.
On those positive words, that fits nicely into my transition to the second round of questions, where we try to elaborate a little bit what kind of shift we want to see in this new legislative mandate that just started, what is needed for us to achieve safety. If possible, trying to elaborate a little bit on certain concrete changes in policies we want to see, but not necessarily. And I'd like to just follow up from just picking up the last bit from the previous round of questions with Elina on spyware, which is kind of maybe the low-hanging fruit. It sounds obvious what needs to be done. Can you let us know what is your views on a world where spyware or surveillance, intrusive surveillance at large, get not normalized or legalized so easily?
Yeah, I think I echo your words. It seems like, you know, we know what we should do, but it's the road to do that that's kind of complicated, it seems. I mean, I think maybe start with a larger, maybe perhaps vision that I think connects most of the points that we have all shared today, especially you, Sarah, Jennifer. Like, I think I would love to see a world where we don't have surveillance models fueling these toxic perceptions of like national security and safety. Spyware is one of those, obviously, but so many others that we've talked about, where people can thrive and enjoy their human rights without thinking that they got to trade off privacy or other rights to be able to enjoy others. But I think also there are other ways to think about this problem or issue from the lens of international human rights law perspective. Like, I think this framework offers very clear guidelines on what are the instances where some of these discussions could you know, take space and where it couldn't. And I think that with certain types of spyware, with Pegasus Predator, for example, I think that by design, they're not able, its use is not able, it's not possible to guarantee that you will guarantee as a state officer, as a government officer, that you won't violate rights. There are certain kinds of these tools that just at this current stage, as they are designed, it doesn't matter, from my perspective, this might sound controversial, but it's clear under international human rights law. Doesn't matter if you put ex ante or ex post checks and balances. The design of the tool is too abrasive, is too invasive, it doesn't comply with proportionality tests, so we shouldn't even be talking about their existence. That's like a starting point. I also think that in general, thinking about how to counter how accessible these tools are and also recognize the role that certain industry players and certain countries have been playing in making sure that these tools are available to anyone that can procure a couple $1 million and have access to these tools should be questioned as well. So I think in that sort of division that, what we want to see is more determined action to be able to counter the export-import dynamics. We've talked earlier about export controls. That is a way that I think we can try to find some sort of elements that could block facilitating that. I think that the fact that Europe has been an actor, whether by omission or ignorance or active participation, we can debate on that, but conclusion is that Europe has been a key actor in this, facilitating these harms, allowing companies to develop and deploy these tools, allowing them to be able to trade them off to other countries, allowing them to be able to use them inside Europe. And we're not calling that into enough questioning. And I think that it's time for us to take action on that. And I think the final point in this vision, and might be a little bit ambitious, but I think is what we need, because it is where we are. It's also accountability and remedy. I think that oftentimes we don't talk about non-repetition guarantees. What are the things that are gonna allow us to not be here, 5 years from now and be like, well, you remember in that panel when we were talking about these things. Like, hopefully we won't have to sit down here again and talk about this, because we did what we have to do, which is to make sure that survivors of surveillance had access to justice to find out who did it, why, when, how, and have reparations for that. And hopefully we also establish accountability mechanisms to prevent this from happening again.
That's quite a comprehensive program, from starting at the root cause, which is the existence of a thriving industry that goes unregulated, the fact that we have a monoculture in certain software and devices, which when you find one way to infect one device, you infect them all. So we also have a problem of monopolies and oligopolies on on device manufacturers and providers that we need to tackle, with more autonomy given to communities, to people, to have agency over their device. And I wanted to, in this kind of context of in high intrusiveness and almost like cyber weapons, mass surveillance, we're trying to conceptualize a right to encryption, the right to also keep your data safe, to have the integrity of your terminal equipment guaranteed. A little bit like you would think of the right to housing. The right to housing enable people to enjoy their right to dignity and to security to a certain extent. Why not a right to encryption, for example, or digital security to enable the right to privacy? And Anna, I'd like to try and stimulate a little bit your creative side from a regulator's perspective and lawyer's perspective. We have a legal basis in the treaty, Article 16.1 for the nerds in the room, to adopt secondary legislation to protect the right to data protection. It was just used once, I think, or twice, for the GDPR, the LED, and the EU DPR. Do you think this legal basis could be used further to advance people's rights in the EU?
Thank you. Not a difficult question at all. And I'm just speaking for myself, and this is not the official position of the EDPS here.
Please.
First of all, yes, of course, Article 16 can be used, and I hope it has already been useful in terms of providing a baseline of protection. At the same time, the lawyer in me immediately screams, yes, but it's about data protection, it's not about confidentiality. And when we discuss spyware, even access to devices, yes, it's both. But traditionally, I think it has been more approached from the side of confidentiality, but certainly something to be explored. A word of caution, though, from someone who, as I mentioned, has been working in Brussels in this space for far too long now. I'm a lawyer, but I do recognize there is such a thing as the principle of action-reaction, and I do believe that if it wasn't for end-to-end encryption solutions being much more available to anybody, really, then law enforcement and others wouldn't be necessarily so attached to the idea of having some spyware-like tools to allow them access to data. So it's all interconnected, in fact. And I think we need to be mindful of this, as this debate around spyware, government access to data, is also very much ongoing in the EU, as you must be aware. And these questions about to what extent law enforcement could have, should have, would have access to data on device, even when encrypted, are very much debated there and will continue to be debated.
Can you explain what initiative you're referring to now? Because maybe some people are not aware in the room.
Yes. So this is, again, something that the EDPS has only been invited as an observer. It is not our initiative, but the presidency of the Council and the Commission have jointly set up what they called a high-level group on, essentially, I can't give you a full name now, but it's government access, law enforcement access to electronic data, or law enforcement access to data.
Access to data for effective law enforcement.
You see, thank you. Yes.
Also known as Adele.
Adele.
Great branding.
Yeah.
Not the ones you think,
Also
not the ones you want.
Also known as Going Dark, high-level group. Still, I mean, maybe what I'm going to say is not going to make me super popular with this audience, but I have actually assisted in some of the discussions, even at technical level in the working groups, and on occasion it was much more balanced and I would say encouraging than I would have expected. So I personally do believe that there are some low-hanging fruits there, and that there might be surprising alliances between law enforcement agencies and some of the intelligence communities and civil society and data protection people, because ultimately we share some of the same interests in strong data protection, confidentiality safeguards, in maintaining the effectiveness of end-to-end encryption, not backdooring stuff, not implementing client-side scanning, which is also under discussion in another file, as some of you will know. So that has come, I have to say, as quite a surprise to me, despite so many years, in these discussions, that in fact, from unexpected corners, you might get allies who would also speak out in defense of end-to-end encryption and strong safeguards, and who actually would very much not like any backdoors on phones, because that is also very much detrimental to cybersecurity, to national security, to police work. So again, my understanding is that there will be one last meeting of this group in November, resulting in possibly a revamped or beefed up version of recommendations that will be put out. And again, this is going to be about pretty much everything, and by all means not only spyware or data retention, but hopefully something that will guide us for future dialogues for the years to come.
Thank you for the hints for future advocacy efforts towards this. I haven't seen the nuances in the recommendations that you saw in private technical meetings, but hopefully the report may change that. I'd like to link back to the question of the criminalization of migration. And I think one important piece that connects all those puzzle piece is the, as Sarah already mentioned, the facilitation package, which include yet again a reform and expansion of Europol's mandate. Lise, you're going to be on this, working on this again. I don't want to give you too much time because we're running out of time on what is wrong with this, because we know what's wrong with this. Even if you don't know the file, you can imagine what's wrong in it. So I'd like rather for you to focus on the vision for your migration policies from the Greens, which do not treat people as de facto crime suspect. If the Greens came to power tomorrow, what would happen?
Thank you, Chloe, for this dystopia question, but we never know. Yeah, indeed, the good part with Europol is like when you get into Europol, it's a long-term investment because there is a reform every 2 years, actually. And just van der Leyen also announced actually a new reform in the coming term. So that will be, that will make 3 reforms in the space of 6 years. Very productive. I'm not going to go into details, as you said, about the facilitators package. It's bad, nearly from A to Z, especially on the regulation side. Happy to discuss further if anyone is interested afterwards. I just hope on the regulation it's going to be actually, withdrawn somehow or scrapped, which actually the Council, also like in a weird alliance, the Council has moved forward on the regulation and actually scrapped most of the provisions. So that's quite maybe a positive development. On our vision on European migration policies, I mean, it's clearly for the Greens a very big change in paradigm. I mean, now, today, the current discourse, as a mainstream discourse, is treating migration as an internal security issue. And as a problem, actually. For us, it's a cultural, a societal, an economic, and a social opportunity. It's not a problem. So this is the first switch we need to change. And I think from there, a lot of things can actually evolve in a better direction. We need to counter the narrative. I mean, collectively, to counter the narrative of migration as a risk and to put like migration as an opportunity instead. We have to acknowledge that the current policies are not efficient and that the pact actually, which was adopted last year, will not be efficient either, which actually makes things worse and on so many levels, which you actually described already. The new paradigm on migration should be a migration policy based on reception and solidarity, sure and safe and legal pathways, obviously no externalization, but also and I mean, acknowledging that migration is here to stay and actually making the life of people which are in our countries undocumented for now to regularize them. Sorry, this is a bit of a French word put to English, but we need to give a proper situation to people which are here, and we need to ensure everybody will be able to migrate safely and freely. You talked about the privatization earlier. I mean, we need also to spend less money in building walls and on fortress Europe as a whole, also like including internal security databases. I mean, you mentioned Eurodac. Just Eurodac is like something now. Fingerprints will be taken as from the age of 6 years old. So 6 years old coming to our borders will be considered as a risk. I mean, what does that tell about our civilization? It's extremely concerning. Maybe also one thing, I mean, if we actually would come into power and if we could, like, get all the portfolios in the European Commission, the first thing I think we would do is actually to separate the portfolio of internal security and migration. This has nothing to do together. This is the first thing we should do. And then we should also assess, I mean, you mentioned interoperability, and now little by little, actually, new internal security policies are scratching fundamental rights, are preventing rule of law. We have to assess the existing policies, because today internal security agenda is driven by news, which sometimes are extremely bad news, sad news. I cannot say something else, but we cannot only react. We need to assess what are the actual needs. So the first thing we should do is actually assess the entire compound of legislation we have at the moment and ensure they are fundamental rights compliant, are they actually even needed at all? Like, this is the direction we would take. Little second of self-promotion, the Greens have actually written down a few proposals on internal security and our vision for the future of internal security, taking into account the inputs of many stakeholders from civil society. Also happy to share and discuss if you want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lise. That was very summarized and comprehensive, but that is interesting to put on the table and to further discuss. I want to give the floor to Jennifer now. There's been some worrying development in Germany recently in a form of a typical kind of moral panic response to the attacks in Solingen. What is happening? What is the security package from the ruling coalition consist of? What does it consist of? And how do you organize? How do you resist in such a hostile environment with raising authoritarian policies?
Maybe first is to give an impression how Germany has become, because I think the topic of migration has been the center of all political parties. So we don't know who is left, we don't know who is right, we don't know who is center, because the rhetorics are the same. And the most interesting thing is that they do not focus on the problems the people are facing. And I will put a context, for example, on the far right, the AfD and the other parties that are focused on the east of Germany, which has had problems since the fall of the wall, the coming back, the reunification of the country. And 30 years after, you can hear rhetorics of inequalities, and for the first time I even had colonization being spoken about, that the West colonized the East. That was a very interesting perspective to hear. And these issues are not being addressed, but the addressing comes in one unity when you talk of migration. And I still want to point out that the migration has been used as a scapegoat, because we have nothing to do with the low birth rate of the Europeans. We have nothing to do with your old aging demography. We have nothing to do with the war in Ukraine or the fear of the war now. We have nothing to do with your labor shortage. But everything is being centered around migration. That's the most horrifying thing. And I want to point out very clearly that in these events of far-right and anti-migration rhetorics, there will be violence on both sides. And this is how the violence will reproduce itself, is that the states will start taking all these measures. And to be clear, where Germany, for example, I'm talking about Germany now because that's where I'm based. When something happens, people opt for they call the police to protect them. This is what a normal white German would do. And we would want to ask the police to protect us. But would we get protected? Where we come from, we believe in self-defense. So the first instinct when you get attacked, you will think of defending yourself, not calling the police. Because even when you call the police will not protect you. So in both ways, there will be violence. In both ways, there will be violence. And I have not seen the grown-up who will going to start having this discussion on how to confront these violences that are already starting to take place. And this is now going to be reproduced on the externalized borders. And again, I'm not going to go into that direction because I think you're very nervous on time. But I have a very clear solution because we want to look for solutions. We would love to build borders around our resources. And then in 5 years, we would not have this discussion. And make sure we implement the same tools of, that you're putting across, that bodies of people from the global south do not come to the global north, and put around our resources, and this would be the finishing of the discussion. We will not come here. Because the issues as to why people are fleeing is never discussed. It is never discussed. The reasons, the continuation of the exploitation and fair trade, the production of war, and in this context, when you talk about development aid, you know what they are doing? The externalization of borders and still taking the lands and which is clear that the population of our countries are growing, but the lands are not growing. So when you still come to take our land for externalized borders, and besides, still continuing to grow colonial crops that we have to keep reproducing to maintain and to keep your coffee table, to have your teas at the coffee table. If we build resources around, we build walls around our resources, nobody wants to build Europe. You can take that to the bank.
Sarah, how are you going to follow up with this?
Yeah, why would you do that?
I'm glad I'm not sitting in your seat. I'd like nonetheless to ask you, I'm sure you're going to do great, what policy shifts Equinox wants? What should we working towards collectively? What is for you the next battleground to shift away from suspicion, surveillance, punishment, and go towards protection?
Yeah. Okay, so what we want, right? Maybe just going back a little bit. Earlier, Lise, Anna, you referred to some dynamics that are going on in EU policies, right? Like, we're seeing the legitimization sometimes through policies of things like spyware, and also the dynamic that you've mentioned, Lise, about the EU basically doing some shady stuff, illegal stuff, and then later legalizing it. That is what we are describing when we talk about this expansive securitization, digital securitization project. It's going to keep continuing until something radical changes. And that very much stresses me out. Like, that expanding process stresses me out. We are not going to change that unless we change the underlying assumptions behind that entire framework, right? The underlying assumptions we talked about already, that digital tech and security will bolster these securitization processes. They will somehow keep us safer, but who safer? We don't ask the question. And that assumption is, we have to tackle that assumption because it's very harmful. Not only does it ignore the harms that come to racialized communities through that process, but it also ignores the fact that this is money we're talking about, resources that we're talking about that are invested in this framework. This framework goes to more police, border guards, prisons, securitization agents, and mostly that's going back to the market, right? That's going back into the industry that produces these systems and that profits from our desire for safety. A very real and strong desire for safety, and not for this sort of vision of violence on both sides, right? So I think in order to address that, we can talk about legislation, we can talk about policies, yes, but we have to address that underlying ideology behind this securitization process in general. I think for that, we need to be asking questions like, why would we spend resources on these things? Where would those resources be better going? And for that to happen, I think we need a really vast redistributed shift away from systems of punishment, control, surveillance in our policy frameworks, in our legislation, in our resources, to things that keep us safe, actually. So social provision, protection, care. We need those types of systems, and we need to invest resources into those systems. We can talk about reforming. We can talk about data protection, impact assessments. We can talk about oversight on those systems. But unless we have this broad redistributive shift at a policy level, at a societal and a political level, we will not attack that ongoing expanding process. We will not address it. It will keep going on and on and on. So what would this redistributive shift look like? I think it means investing resources in addressing the root causes of this violence that we've talked about. So in addition to creating walls around all the resources in the global south, which I think we should also agree, I think we should do, but we're also thinking about how would we resource people who are living in poverty? How would we address putting money towards our healthcare systems, social provision systems, completely devoid of the question of tech? How would we dedicate the resources that we're spending on surveillance tech from Israel or militarization of EU borders? Why wouldn't we shift that money away from all of that and towards the things that address the root causes and the problems that we are dealing with on an everyday basis? That is the redistributive shift that I think we really need to be thinking about. I was asked to be concrete, and so there are some concrete things that I think come with that redistributive shift too. There's some reactive and proactive policy measures that we could take. I think the first one, looking at the Facilitators Directive, like that is coming up and is something we could all be working on. We need to resist the criminalization of migration and assistance of migration in the law, resisting all the ways that that law increases the legal framework for criminalizing assisting migration, including through digital means. We need to reject this proposal to expand Europol in that framework. Not just about the money, but the entire expansive framework. We shouldn't reform that legislation. We should reject it entirely. We can also think about specific policies and advocacy campaigns to stop the EU funding and also commissioning, procuring, but also funding surveillance technology in Israel. I think we should specifically do that, and we have the means at our disposal to do that if that's a priority for us. So when we talk about keeping people safe, not just about us here, but across the world, that's something very proactive that we could do. I think there's some work about accountability of the agents of the state. There's no law that requires agents of the state, immigration authorities, police authorities to not discriminate. There's no law at EU level, and I think there could be. We should be advocating for that, and that is something that we are going to advocate for. And then lastly, away from the legislation, away from the policy, away from the frameworks and the sort of safeguards, I think we need to be talking about the way the EU puts its resources. So the EU will, again, enter its framework of the multi-annual financial framework. It makes active decisions about how it spends its money. And I think there really needs to be an active and coordinated civil society campaign on how do we redistribute resources away from the police, away from border guards, away from surveillance tech, into these things that we need, into things that address social inequality, violence, and harm to our communities. And if we really invested in that project, I think we would have this redistributive shift. So yeah, that's what we want.
Just that. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I'm asked to wrap up, although it's just started to be interesting, right? Can I get a new round of applause for all our speakers? Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights. I think now we have more or less a draft policy and plan ahead. And as Elina said, it's just the road is hard. But we'll manage together, right? Is that what I'm supposed to say? I am now closing the panel and leaving it to the closing word. So stay in the room if you want to hear. No, it's in the patio for the closing of this event. And thank you so much for coming and for your attention.